This is the Curta Calculator Type I. The Curta! Made in Liechtenstein in 1952. The Curta Calculator is the greatest mechanical calculator ever created. That's what they say, at least. And what more can I say about the Curta? When I was a boy, I dreamed of being a man. When I was a man, I dreamed of being a man with a Curta. I've been aware of the Curta for a long time, since before I started collecting old adding machines, and to be honest, I never really thought I'd get a Curta. Believe it or not, I don't really go for high-end stuff. Almost all the things you'll see in my videos cost me less than $40. Probably the most expensive thing was around $100. But a decent working Curta will run you about $1,000, and I don't really go for that sort of thing. But about a year ago, this Curta came to me as a gift. A shocking gift, really, and I still don't quite know how to react other than to say thank you. This is the first chapter of a 12-part series all about the Curta. Now, you don't have to look too hard to find videos about the Curta on YouTube. This guy did one, this guy did some, even this guy did one. So what could I possibly have to add? Well, the simple fact is, I have a Curta, and I make videos about old calculating machines. So what am I going to do? Make 0 videos about the Curta? No, I'm going to make 12 videos about the Curta. The basic operation of the Curta calculator is addition. You input the number by sliding these sliders here. So here's like 1, 2, 3, 4. And I can add it by turning the crank once around. The answer appears in these little windows around the top. Now if I want to add another number, I slide that one in too, turn the crank, and it adds. You can actually see the addition happening 1 digit at a time, more or less right to left, just like you would do on paper. This is different from a typical desktop machine, which somehow does everything all at once. This digit by digit adding is a consequence of how the internals work, but we'll leave that for later. You can see pretty well that the answer digits are on tiny spinning wheels. There's tons of little like clickety-clacks. It's like watching one of those old train station signs. The input sliders also stay where they are after you add each number. That's to help you out when you're doing multiplication. But we'll leave that for later. Most desktop machines would clear out the input every time unless you switch it into the repeat mode. But the Curta is like permanently in the repeat mode. By the way, these little nubs up here can slide around, but they're not connected to the mechanism. You use them to mark where your decimal point is, or even as a visual separator if you want to work with 2 numbers at once. Anyway, that's how you do addition. There's another readout over here in the silver where it just counts how many times you turn the crank. That's to help with multiplication. But people say the Curta looks kind of like a grenade, and one reason is this thing here, the clearing ring. You spin this guy around and it zeroes out each digit as you go. You can go all the way around to clear the answers and the counter, or you can just do one or the other. One difference from a typical desktop machine is in the way you do subtraction. On like a Monroe machine or a typical pinwheel machine, you subtract by just turning the crank backwards. It's simple and intuitive, although you have to remember which direction is which. But the Curta crank only turns in one direction. It just doesn't turn backwards. So to subtract, you need to put it in subtraction mode, which you do like this. Now it's subtraction. You crank it and it subtracts the number and the counter counts down by 1. So if I want to just do a simple subtraction like this here, I input the first number in addition mode, then doink over to subtraction mode and crank in the second number. It works. If you look carefully while it subtracts, you can see some kind of funny business here. Check it out. I'm going to add 2 and then immediately subtract 2. And look at this. That digit doesn't just turn back to 0. It actually turns forward past 9 and around to 0. And every other digit spins all the way around. It turns out the Curta internally doesn't do direct subtraction, but it always subtracts by adding. But we'll leave that for later. And what happens if you subtract past 0, you ask? Here, let's do 0 minus 1. All 9s, man. I guess that's like an error or something. So it doesn't really do negative numbers. But hey, check this out. I want to do this bunch of stuff here. Now, if I do it on a calculator that does handle negatives, it looks like this. I do 2403 minus 8732, which ends up being negative, which this calculator can do. And then I'm going to add 7142, and it all works out. On the Curta, I add the first number, 2403, then subtract 8732, which rolls it back, and I get this crazy thing. But I'm just going to keep going. Add 7142, and it still ends up with the right answer. It's a Kurtzmas miracle. So I guess the Curta kind of can do negative numbers. They just look weird. Like -7 looks like this on the Curta. Okay. I didn't mention this thing yet. It's the only ordinary looking switch on the whole thing. But we'll leave that for later. I gotta fill 11 episodes here. Curt always described his machine as a 4-function calculator. That's addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. The standard operation is addition, and you switch to subtraction with the doink here. So where's the multiplication mode? Well, there isn't like a switch for that. Multiplications are done by repeated additions. So if I want to do this multiplication, I dial in the big number and then crank it 8 times. It works. This is the purpose of the counter register. As you're going, and once you're done, you have a visual check just to be sure you cranked the right number of times. And now you can see the whole calculation laid out. This number times 8 equals this number. What if I wanted to multiply times 18? Well, I could crank it 18 times, and that works fine. But who's got the time for that? There is one last feature that I haven't told you about. The digit shifter. The entire knurled top piece here, including the answer and the counter digits, can shift to other positions. In the default position, you're just adding the number like normal. But if I shift the thing over by 1 position, now it'll add the number into the tens digit instead of the ones digit. That means to multiply by like 18, I add 8 times in the ones position, then shift over and add 1 time in the tens position. And just like before, you can see it all to make sure you did it right. This number times 18 is this number. If you want to get real fancy, you can do cute tricks with subtractions to make it even faster. Like for 18, I cranked 8 times over here and then 1 time here. That's a lot of cranks. Doing a lot of cranks is kind of slow, and it also increases the chances that I'll lose count and mess it up. But instead of cranking 18, I could do 20 like this, then subtract 2 like this, If you want to really impress your friends, you could do the -2 part first. You'll roll the machine under, and all your dumb friends will think you messed it up. But who's the idiot now, huh? It's pretty satisfying to do a big multiplication on the Curta. How about this one? It works. Here's something cute that people made a big deal out of back then. Simultaneous parallel calculations. Here's a true story. I was cooking a couple weeks ago using a recipe, and I wanted to scale it up. Yogurt flatbreads. They're good. I had to multiply each ingredient by 4.7. This is a true story. So the recipe looks like this. It's just part of the recipe, of course. And I need to multiply each one by 4.7. Now, for me personally, I just multiply by 4.7 2 separate times and write down the 2 answers. But back in the day, people wanted the machine to be able to do both at once. And the Curta can do that. I'm going to enter my 2 different numbers next to each other on the input. I'll separate them out as far as possible. And if you want, you can put these sliders in there just to visually keep track of where each separate number goes. Remember, these sliding things don't actually do anything in the calculation. They're just cosmetic to help you keep track of things. Anyway, I got my 2 numbers in there, and now I just multiply by 4.7. Really, you do 47. You keep track of the decimal points yourself. Those 2 separated numbers in the input give me 2 separated answers in the answers. I got 893 and 611. Okay, it works. It's weird that this kind of parallel calculation was regarded as like a killer feature in the old days. I mean, our modern calculators don't do that, and nobody seems to want to do that. But I guess I never thought about it before. Maybe this is something that everybody wants. We just don't know we want it. It's like Steve Jobs said, people don't know what they want until you show it to them. Well, okay, I just showed you parallel multiplications on a handheld calculator. Do I want that? Not really. Just like in a modern computer, there is, buried deep inside the Curta, a core, a central processing unit where the computation really happens at a fundamental level. The beating heart of the Curta is the stepped drum mechanism. Every cranking mechanical adding machine needs some way for the user input to affect the mechanism inside. Like if I input a 3, that's got to somehow change the gears around inside so that it adds 3 instead of something else. Some machines use the pinwheel mechanism. That's a system of gears with retractable pins. So if you want to add 7, you make the gear have 7 teeth. You want to add 4, you make the gear have 4 teeth. When I adjust the sliders on a pinwheel machine, I'm actually changing the number of teeth on the gears. It works well, but it's kind of delicate to make those pins pop in and out. The Curta's mechanism is a bit mechanically simpler than that. The stepped drum is a big cylindrical drum with these steps on it. If I put a gear down here at the bottom and spin it once around, the gear gets hit by all 9 steps. But if I put it further up, it'll hit a different number of steps. So you can pretty easily vary the counting amount. You just move your counter wheel up and down the drum. A typical desktop adding machine using stepped drums will have a different stepped drum for each digit. The input buttons will either move the counting gears up and down the drums, or maybe the gears will be fixed and the drums will move. Here's a clip from Stephen Freeborn's channel of a classy traditional stepped drum machine. By the way, if you like my videos, you should definitely check out Stephen Freeborn. He's got really amazing machines and always has good things to say about them. The stepped drum was the main mechanism for the Monroe adding machines. Here's a video by Robert Baruch where he totally disassembled a Monroe Model K. And there's the stepped drums. The stepped drum mechanism was actually invented in the 1600s by mathematical legend Gottfried Leibniz. So the stepped drum was totally old news by the time Curt came around, but it's really the perfect mechanism for the Curta. Curt realized he could actually put several counter wheels on the same stepped drum. Now you can't put them next to each other since they all need to move freely up and down the drum. But how about this, huh? This is exactly how the Curta is set up. One big central stepped drum with 8 sliding counting gears positioned in a circle around it. And the sliders on the face of the device just directly slide the counters up and down. It's all beginning to make sense. The actual step drum inside the Curta looks like this. The first thing I notice is that the Curta's drum isn't a full cylinder, but that doesn't really matter. As long as you include all the teeth you need, it works fine. But this is weird. At the very bottom, you got 9 steps, and then moving up, you got 8, 7, 6, and 5, but then it just goes back up, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So how would you ever do like 4 or 3 steps? And some of the steps are sort of isolated teeth, but some are these solid bars. This is weird, but Curt knows what he's doing. Here, I made an unrolled version of the drum just so we can see it better. So when you position a counter wheel here at the bottom, it'll hit 9 teeth, so it'll add 9. You move it up 1 click, it'll add 8. All right, good so far, but what about in the middle? Well, here it'll add 6, and then 5, and then 1 more click up. Look at the spacing. Now it's in between, so it only hits the solid bars, so it only adds 4. Next click, it only adds 3. It's in between. See, that gap in the middle is actually 1.5 times the usual size of the gaps. So it goes in between. All right, so what about all those other gears at the top that it's going in between? Like, what do those even do? Well, let me remind you of this. The subtraction mode. This little doink here shifts the drum by exactly half a position. So if I was adding 3 and then I pop the doink, the whole thing shifts by a half position like this. And now instead of 3, it's going to add 7. But if you're just looking in that one digit, adding 7 is the same as subtracting 3. The in-betweens is what makes the subtraction mode work. See, really what we have here is 2 separate stepped drums, one for subtraction and one for addition, and they've been superimposed on top of each other like 2 parallel universes. And to jump from one to the other, you just pop the doink. Curt, man, you got it. The physical design of the Curta is pretty remarkable. Really, it's the thing that makes the Curta special. In my opinion, it's pretty much a perfect design. In production from 1948 to 1970, and they didn't really change a thing that whole time. The most striking thing about it is also the most obvious. It's really small. I'd always seen pictures and videos of it, but it's really striking when you hold it in your hand. The first time I had one in real life, I felt like I was holding some kind of miniature replica of a Curta. But it's the real thing. Smaller than a coffee cup, smaller than a soda can, a bit bigger than Ukrainian Elsa. The inventor, Curt actually spent decades thinking about the design long before he was able to build it. Curt grew up working on calculating machines. His dad owned a company that built their own machines, and Curt was involved at all levels of the company: sales, marketing, machine repair, R&D for new improvements. He was selling these things even when he was a little kid. Curt said that while working sales for the Hertzstark company, the most common question he got was, isn't there anything smaller? Especially people working in the field, they would have to keep heavy, expensive machines either in their trucks or they'd have to drive back to the office to actually run the numbers. Everybody wanted to make something small, but it wasn't really working. In an interview, Curt said, "Everyone tried to build a small machine, but no one had the courage for a new system, so they tried to miniaturize the existing technology, which does not make sense." Curt knew that a truly handheld machine would have to be redesigned from scratch, and his design approach was really interesting. He approached it more like a discovery than a creation. I thought to myself, I'll pretend that I have already invented everything. What does this kind of machine really have to look like so that someone could use it? He was like, well, I know I want to hold it in one hand, so let's start there. With any sort of mechanism in there, it can't be flat, so it ought to be a cylinder. You hold it in one hand and you work it with the other. And if it is a cylinder and it needs to have a crank for the mechanism inside, well, you're not going to put the crank on the side like this. It has to be on the top. What else you need? You need input sliders and answer digits. And we got two surfaces to work with. The top next to the crank, or there's still some space on the cylinder part. The input sliders need to be as big as possible for usability. So let's put those on the large side of the cylinder, and that leaves the top for the answer digits. Curt put it this way: I designed the ideal machine from the outside first before I designed the insides. But beyond the layout of the thing, the design is masterful. I always love white on black writing. This arrow indicates which digit you're set to in the answers, and this arrow points to the active digit in the counter. The bottom of every Curta has a unique serial number, and it also tells you the model. There was a Type I and also a Type II. Mine's the Type I. There are pretty detailed lists online of the serial numbers. According to them, my number indicates a production year of 1952. The contrasting textures are really unique, and it makes it very satisfying to hold. A smooth, matte black surface next to these bumpy parts. The bumps are one place where a Curta might show some wear. Straight out of the factory, it was all black, but over time the paint wears off at the very ends of the bumps. Those are some serious knurls. The crank has the same knurls pattern, which is a nice touch. The knob also spins freely. This means you don't have to readjust your grip as you go around. And I absolutely love the clearing ring. Most multiplying machines just use cranks for clearing. You have the main drive crank, and then next to the answers, there's a little crank for clearing it. So the natural choice for Curt would have been two cranks, one for the drive and one for clearing. But two concentric cranks on the end would be a real pain to use. You wouldn't be able to spin one around without bumping into the other one. Curt's solution is this ring, which is just perfect. When you stick your finger in there, it naturally ends up parallel to the crank knob, so you're not going to move them both by accident. Unfortunately, the ring is also maybe the weakest part on the machine physically. It sticks out past the profile of the cylinder, so it could easily snag on something, and it's just a very thin piece of metal. The Curt itself is pretty solid, and typically it'll be alright if you drop it, but if it lands face down on the ring, you might have a problem. The ring is held on by a screw and this little button here. If you push down on the button, it'll release the ring and let you collapse it down. And in this position, the thing fits perfectly into its original metal case. The case is simple and perfect. There is not really a lot to say about it. The top has a soft rubber plug in it to grab the top of the Curta perfectly, so it's always snug in there. Unfortunately, that soft rubber plug does dry out over the decades, so many Curtas today have something else shoved in there as a replacement. Mine still has the original rubber, but it is disintegrating. You can see in some of my shots the top of my Curta has little specks of the cracked rubber on it, which flake down in tiny amounts every time I put it in the case. The most notable thing about the case is the screw-on cap, which is reverse threaded. Some models of the case even had a little arrow on them to remind you. This is another extreme quality measure. Since there's that rubber plug in the cap, it is possible that screwing on the cap will cause the crank to move a little bit. And moving the crank isn't really a big deal. It's not going to break the machine. But since the crank only goes one way, if the crank gets turned even just a little bit by the cap, then you're going to have to turn it the rest of the way around before you use it, which means the counter won't be zeroed out anymore and you have to clear it again. Curt wanted to be sure the machine was ready to use as soon as he took it out. My boy thought of everything. These are some highlights from the amazing life story of Curt Hertzstark, mostly taken from a long interview with Curt himself that was conducted by Erwin Tomasz from the Charles Babbage Institute in September 1987, about a year before Curt died. I'm just going to give you a few moments, but it's worth reading the whole thing. I'll put a link down there. I decided not to use the usual historical photographs you see in stories like this, so it'll be mostly Curta footage. The Buchenwald concentration camp was one of the first and one of the largest Nazi camps. About 300,000 prisoners were held there, and about a fourth of them died there. In the days after the camp was liberated, General George Patton was there for a few days. Legendary journalist Edward R. Murrow was there for a few days. And Curt Hertzstark, inventor of the Curta Calculator, was there too. Curt had been walked into Buchenwald by SS officers and dogs. And over a year later, Curt walked out alone. Curt was born as a baby in 1902 in Vienna, Austria, the son of Samuel Hertzstark, a Jewish engineer who had his own adding machine factory. Curt left school early to work for the Hertzstark company, and by his 20s he was already a major player. He would drive all over Europe, demonstrating the machines, repairing broken machines, even coming up with some original designs of his own. Curt says it was in the late 1920s that he started hearing requests for small machines, and his ideas for the Curta started to take shape. Over the next 10 years or so, he worked on it as a side project, and by 1937 he had the basic form factor settled, and he even built a prototype that could add and subtract. Curt was all ready to get serious about producing this thing in the Hertzstark factory, but less than 6 months later, Austria officially became part of Nazi Germany. After living in Buchenwald for about a year, Curt was sent to a totally different facility, an underground factory building bombs for the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Curt and a small group of other prisoners lived over there for a couple of months in early 1945 in relative safety, fixing up the machinery. Meanwhile, the Americans were closing in on Buchenwald, and the Nazis knew they wouldn't be able to hold it. There were plans to completely destroy the camp before leaving, but instead they just marched the prisoners out, eventually to other camps. Most of those evacuated prisoners didn't survive. And as those prisoners were marching down the road away from Buchenwald, Curt and his group got marched back to Buchenwald. The guys in charge of Curt's group weren't real SS. They were like local guys, old men with dogs and hunting rifles. And they hadn't been told that the camp was being evacuated. So Curt's group of about 40 actually passed hundreds of prisoners on the road walking the other way. He says they yelled back and forth to each other, like, "Where are you guys going?" Nobody knew what was going on. When Curt's group made it back to Buchenwald, the place was mostly empty. There were still a lot of prisoners, but not many guards. And a few days later, the Americans arrived. It only took them a few minutes to clear the place out. Curt remembered the guy sitting in the front seat of the first Jeep. He was chewing gum loudly. He gave Curt a pack of Lucky Strikes. After the war, the old Hertzstark business was dead. The family still had the factory, but the infrastructure and the demand in Vienna just couldn't support it. So Curt started looking for foreign companies who could produce the Curta. He got an offer from the Remington Rand Company, but it never panned out. Curt was close to making another deal with a Swiss adding machine company called Precisa, but then he got an official invitation to the palace of the Prince of Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein was neutral during the war, and the relatively undamaged country saw an opportunity to become a technical leader in the new Europe. They loved Curt's invention, and they offered him a deal that Precisa couldn't compete with. As it turned out, it was kind of a bad deal, and Curt wound up regretting his choice. The folks in Liechtenstein created a new company called Contina, with Curt as the chief technical director, and the Curta as their only product. The first finished units appeared on the market in 1949. Curt left the company 3 years later. As soon as Curt arrived in Buchenwald, he was brought to the guy in charge of the camp's factory. They had a whole file about Curt, his background, his skills in engineering. The camp was running a factory with slave labor from the prisoners, but the head engineer understood that Curt would know the machines better than anyone else on site. The engineer said, "Listen, Herr Stark, there's no policing here. You have to take care of yourself, because the sun will shine again one day for you." So Curt was able to avoid the dangerous, exhausting work that killed so many others there. He was allowed to receive letters and packages of food from his mother. During the days, Curt would work on the machines in the factory, keep them running. He was also allowed to bring in other prisoners to help if he thought it was necessary, and Curt ended up inventing a bunch of fake jobs just to keep people safe. From time to time, Curt would talk with others about his history in the adding machine business, and even told them about his big idea for a small machine. The head engineer called him in when he heard about it. He said, "I can't take you off your day job, but I like the sound of your idea." And so in the evenings in the Buchenwald concentration camp, Curt drew up the first detailed technical designs for the Curta. The boss said it would make a perfect gift for the Führer when the war was over. From the early days, Curt called his machine the Lilliput. That's what it was called in the Buchenwald drawings. But the suits at Contina didn't like the name. Curt does a great job of describing their arguments over the name, so I'll just quote him. He said, "We do not want any clever, complex, tricky names." He then proceeded to suggest many completely crazy names. They argued about it for a while until one of their salespeople, one of the only women around, spoke up. She said all these names were bad. "The inventor's name is Curt, so we should call it Curta." Good call, lady. Curt left the Contina company in 1952 and moved back to Vienna. The folks at Contina had broken a lot of their financial promises, but Curt made enough money to quietly live out the rest of his days with his wife and 2 kids. He says that if he had stayed at Contina, he would have continued innovating the machine and transitioned to electronics when the time was right. Instead, Contina sold the Curta for over 2 decades without making any innovations at all, and they promptly went out of business when electronics hit the market. I can't really blame them, but I do wonder about what might have been if Curt was in charge. I don't know if Curt saw it this way, but to me, as an observer separated by time and space, Curt's life story is dominated by 2 images, the Curta Calculator and the gates of the Buchenwald concentration camp. And which image is the more powerful, the more enduring? I believe even the gates of hell can't stand forever. Today the gates of Buchenwald are open. The dark soul of that place is gone forever. And the Curta Calculator is here in my hand. Nowadays, the Curta is pretty well known thanks to the internet, but it wasn't always like that. The first time I ever heard of the Curta was in this book. I'm not sure if it counts if it's in a book, but I'm going for it. Pattern Recognition is a 2003 book by legendary science fiction author and reluctant futurist William Gibson. It's set in the present day, which is 2002, and the main character, Case Pollard, is a woman on a globe-trotting adventure to track down a reclusive viral video creator, all while struggling to deal with her egomaniac tech bro boss. This book was written before the cultural rise of viral videos and egomaniac tech bros, so chalk up another one for William Gibson's future casting. I really liked the book. I read it when it was new 20 years ago, and bits and pieces of it still stick with me. Today's math prop first appears in Chapter 4, Math Grenades. Case is walking early in the morning near the Portobello Road Market in London and comes across 3 shady guys standing around selling stuff out of their car trunk. Black, compact, cylindrical. 6 of them laid out on an old gray sweater amid a jumble of brown cardboard cartons. Case thinks that they're grenades at a glance, but she takes a closer look and one of the guys hands her one. And then she's holding it, heavy, dense, knurled for gripping. Tabs or flanges that look as though meant to move in these slots. Small round windows showing white numbers. At the top, something that looks like the crank on a pepper mill as executed by a small arms manufacturer. These guys are selling Curtas on the street in 2002. Now, I've never seen a guy selling a Curta on the street, but there definitely was a community of Curta collectors at that time. And before the rise of eBay, people just had to make it work. So I'll allow it. Gibson's description of the Curta is a pretty good one. He uses the word knurled twice, which I appreciate, and then the guy actually uses it. He gently takes the thing from her, large fingers moving surely, gently, clicking the black tabs into a different configuration. He grasps the knurled cylinder in his left, gives the handle at the top a twirl, smoothly ratcheting a sum from its interior. Gibson's description of the answer display isn't quite right. He describes it as having small round windows showing white numbers, but the answer windows aren't round. Then he says he raises it to see the resulting figure in a tiny window. A tiny window isn't really how I describe it. It is the smallest mechanical calculating machine ever constructed. This certainly isn't literally true, but I guess I know what he means. Case is so stressed out from all her adventures that she has recurring dreams about her father who died at the World Trade Center in the 9/11 attacks. She turns to find him, dressed as she's imagined him to have dressed on that morning. His good overcoat open over his business suit, right hand extended, and in it, the black cylinder of a Curta calculator. The dead can't help you, and the boy's no good. That's deep, I guess. Actually, I'm not totally sure what he's talking about. We get some more action in Chapter 31, the prototype. Case needs to bribe a retired NSA spy, so she buys a Curta factory prototype from a high-end collector. She brings one of those 3 guys from before to make sure it's legit. His fingers slide over it, moving those studs or flanges in their slots or tracks. He pauses, closes his eyes as if listening, and works the little peppermill crank at the top. It makes a slithering sound, if a mechanism can be said to slither. He opens his eyes, looks at the numbers that have appeared in small circular windows. Yes, he says. We'll take it. Again with the circular windows, but otherwise pretty good. Gibson gives a very insightful bit of future casting when he describes the high-end Curta dealer. This guy's got Curtas and he knows they're valuable, but his business is all word of mouth at this point, and a lot of people don't even have any idea what they're worth. The dealer. Last year he began to go after Curtas. The market is not yet entirely rationalized, you see. Values are only just being established for Curta calculators. All such markets are being rationalized by the internet, of course. eBay. He's very adroit there and has sold many Curtas to Americans, always for more than they would fetch here. Global values are being established. Gibson is predicting here that eBay would be used to create a stable market for Curtas. You don't have to meet a guy on the street. You don't have to worry about what's a fair price. eBay and the internet are going to turn this weird little thing into a tradable commodity. Right again, William. In conclusion, I give Pattern Recognition by William Gibson my math props rating of good. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you see any more. The Curta is a 4-function calculator: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. We already did the first 3, so let's try division. It's basically long division, but every step has to be done using only additions or subtractions. The standard long division procedure involves doing a bunch of little divisions digit by digit. So let's start with a really simple one like 45 divided by 9. You need to start with 45 on the answer digits, so I'm just going to add 45 to get started. Now, how many times does 9 go into 45? We can just subtract 9 over and over until it goes down to 0. So I put 9 on the input, pop over to subtraction mode and I start cranking.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, so 45 divided by 9 is 5. Now, I was counting the cranks out loud, but the Curta has a counter in it. But in subtraction mode, the counter counts down. That's so that you can use subtraction to undo an addition. Now, when I'm dividing, really I want the counter to go up, even though you're subtracting. And that, my friends, is the purpose of this switch, the only interface feature that I haven't told you about yet. They call this the reversing lever. Up is the normal position. This makes the counter go up every time you add and down every time you subtract. In the down position, the counter goes down every time you add and up every time you subtract. It's the reverse. The arrows here are trying to indicate this. On top, both arrows are going the same direction, so adding answers adds to the counter and subtracting answers subtracts from the counter. But in the bottom position, subtracting answers adds to the counter, so the arrows are pointing in the opposite directions. I guess the icons here make sense if you already know what they mean. So anyway, to do a division like this, I put 42 in the answer, clear the counter, switch to reverse counting, subtract 7 until it goes down to 0. And now you can see the counter says 6, which is the answer. What if the number doesn't go in evenly, like 45 divided by 7? That looks like this. Now here I had to just stop when I see 3 in the answers, because I'm going to overshoot if I subtract 7 again. So the answer is 6 with a remainder of 3. This business of watching carefully and stopping before you go too far is kind of annoying. It's actually easier to just keep going until it does go too far. It's obvious when that happens because the answer digits all spin back to 9s. So when that happens, it means I did it once too many times, so I can just pop back to addition mode and add 1 back in. This is actually pretty easy to do, even for complicated divisions. Check out this one. You put the big number in the answer, subtract the other one until it underflows, and then add it once back in. Now this is all dividing when the answer is just a single digit. If you want a quotient with multiple digits, you got to do it like in the long division. You divide in each digit starting on the left, and after each digit is done, you get a big remainder. Usually people don't write it this way, and you probably don't think about it like this, but this big number is the remainder after the first digit, and then you move on to the next digit and divide that to get a new remainder. On the Curta, you do exactly the same thing. You start on the digit all the way to the left, subtract until you underflow, then add 1 back in. Now this is the first remainder. And then shift the digit to the right by 1 spot and subtract again. You keep on doing this until you eat up the whole number, and the answer shows as usual on the counter. Hey, let's try this one. Everybody loves 22 over 7. Here's a cute trick. If you enter the input as far left as possible, it's as if you're doing this number instead, so you get lots of decimal digits in the answer. Right on. All of those times I was just dividing by a single digit, but that's not necessary. Here's a big one. It's pretty satisfying to make it all happen. In some ways, this is even easier than multiplication. When you're multiplying, each digit position gets a certain number of cranks that you just have to remember, or you input them as you go. But for a division, you enter all the numbers at the beginning, and then you just start cranking. You don't need to keep track or remember anything as you're doing it. Oddly enough, this long division process highlights one of the only design choices that they made for the Curta, where they skimped on a feature that was common in other machines. You still need to pay attention closely to notice when there's an underflow. Like if you subtracted too far, then you got to add 1 back in. A typical desktop calculator will ding a bell when that happens. It's a usability feature to give you a little extra feedback when it's time to move to the next digit. But on the Curta, no ding! I actually haven't seen any writing about why the bell wasn't included. I'm sure that Curt considered it, but I doubt you could miniaturize a bell to make it fit in there and still function. Maybe you could make like a loud clicking sound or a purely haptic feedback of some sort, but I guess Curt decided either it wasn't necessary or it couldn't be done well. So you just have to watch carefully. The long division process is easy to do, but I find I mess it up a lot. I guess I would get better with practice, but I often forget to pop between addition and subtraction at each step, or sometimes I overshoot the crank and I end up going around an extra time. The crank can't turn backwards, so if you overshoot by a little bit, you have to just keep going all the way around. In my opinion, this may be the weakest part of the Curta's design. The only time when I feel like I wish it worked a little bit differently. It would be a lot more usable if I was able to unwind a partial crank and get back to where I started. But really, this is more of a nuisance than anything. If you ever do add an extra time, you can always just pop to subtraction and immediately undo it. And if you subtract an extra time, you can switch it to addition to undo it. Maybe this sounds complicated, but actually it works fine in practice. So watch carefully and try not to mess it up, but if you do mess it up, it's no big deal. I do kind of miss that ding, though. Alright, I'm here at the Hi-Ho Hotel for the Curtsmas Rally, Day 8. We're going to try and do it in exactly 9 minutes. If you do any reading about the Curta online, you'll learn that the Curta was very popular in road rallies. This is something I've never really heard of before, so let's try it. Start the clock! Now, I'm a simple man and I don't know nothing about nothing. If you ask me, somebody driving in a car race doesn't really need a calculator. You just drive as fast as you can and try to finish first. And how is the Curta going to help you do that? But I was wrong. I learned most of this from the Road Rally Handbook by Clint Goss, which you can get digitally for free. I'll put a link down there. This is the 2020 edition, but it still includes detailed instructions for rallying with the Curta. Thanks, Clint. The Curta was used in what they call a road rally, sometimes more specifically called a TSD rally. That's time, speed, distance. This isn't a race at all. The goal is not to finish as fast as possible. Each driver, together with a navigator, drives a specific route, and the goal is to finish at the exact correct time, no slower, no faster. So it lacks the high adrenaline excitement of traditional car racing and replaces it with something more like balancing your checkbook. It's like a motorsport version of the compulsory figures. And we're doing it! We started at the Hotel Hi-Ho, and we're going to drive to the Aspetuck Valley Apple Barn, which Google Maps says is 5.4 miles away. And we're going to try and do it in exactly 9 minutes. Now, you could just figure out the ideal pace and stick to it, but this isn't always easy.
Uh-oh! That's good. We're too fast anyway, so...
The Curta is used as you're going to make sure that you're on pace. Apparently there were two major strategies for doing this, and we did the East Coast method. The West Coast method is the same, but it uses reciprocals for everything. Anyway, the method is all about comparing the current pace to the ideal mathematical pace, which will hit the target time exactly. Now, since we're going to be adding and multiplying times in minutes, we're not going to use the usual minutes and seconds. Instead, I got a stopwatch that measures in minutes and cents. Cents is the unit for hundredths of minutes. Everything's just easier that way. Anyway, here's how you do it. I figure out my ideal speed ahead of time and convert it to minutes per mile. It's weird, I know. Anyway, for me, I want to take 9 minutes to go 5.4 miles. So that's going to be 1.6 repeating minutes per mile. Put that in the Curta input and we're ready to go. The method is very simple once you're all set up. The Teenage Navigator watches the car odometer, and each time it clicks up by 1/10 of a mile, you crank the Curta. Because of the way we set it up, the answer on the Curta will be telling us what the time ought to be if we were on the perfect pace. Like after you've gone 1.3 miles, that's 13 cranks, this answer here means that the elapsed time ought to be 2.16 minutes. And in the car, you could just compare that with the actual time on the stopwatch. If the stopwatch reads earlier than the Curta, it means you're going too fast. And if it reads later, it means you're going too slow. Does that sound complicated? It's not really. Like right here, the Teenage Navigator just cranked it for the 27th time, and the clock reads 4 minutes 13 cents. But the Curta says 4 minutes 48 cents, so we're running about 35 cents too fast. How's it looking?
We're still a little fast, but it's better than before.
Every 1/10 of a mile, which at our pace is about every 10 seconds, the Teenage Navigator cranks it again, and he's able to say if we're too fast or too slow and by how much. It's pretty foolproof. Like, what if the teenage navigator misses a crank because he's not paying attention? This actually isn't an issue because of the Curta's counter. At all times, the counter should be in sync with the car odometer. So if the navigator spaces out for a while, it can easily get back on track by just cranking until they catch up. I would say the Curta is a great tool for this, and I can see why people continue to use the Curta even after electronic calculators hit the market. Once you're used to doing this on the Curta, it's really not easy to replicate this functionality with electronics, especially being able to see the answer and the counter and update them both. And we're doing a very simple example here. If you read the tutorials about this, you'll see special Curta tricks for, like, if you go off course and you have to backtrack. This messes up your counter because the odometer keeps going up even though you're going the wrong way, so you're going to have to subtract a certain amount of distance. It's as if for a certain part of the trip you wanted the odometer to wind backwards instead of forwards. But the Curta can do that. Another common problem is that car odometers in the old days weren't terribly accurate. So before the rally starts, there's always an odometer calibration course where you drive a certain set distance and you can compare your odometer reading with the course official's odometer. Then while you're going, you need to keep track of your car odometer, but also keeping track of the official true distance. On the Curta, there are tricks for tracking both odometers at the same time using parallel inputs. So how'd we do? Made it to the apple barn in 8.78 minutes. Pretty good. But wait, I was basing all the calculations on the Google Maps distance of 5.4 miles. But I should have known it. My car odometer was not actually the same. My car odometer read 5.33 miles when we arrived. So the distance ended up being less than we expected, so we should have arrived early. Driving the correct pace for 5.33 miles instead should have had us arrive at 8 minutes 88 cents. So we were only 10 cents off. That's 6 seconds. Not bad for a couple of first-timers. When you really plumb the depths of Curta enthusiasm, eventually you'll find some fanboy who'll tell you that the Curta can do square roots, or even crazier things. Now, when a stranger tells you that the Curta can do square roots, they don't really mean what you think they mean. Like, see this calculator? It can do square roots. That's what this thing is for. Okay, fanboy, so where's that thing on the Curta? Well, you gotta understand what I mean, man. Okay, so, there's no button on there, see? But, the machine is more than just the buttons, man. It's like a whole universe of possibilities, man. It's like the Curta is like a way of thinking. It's like a lifestyle, man. You can't just ask me for buttons for every little thing. You gotta respect the journey. What this gentleman means is the Curta doesn't directly do square roots. It only adds, and it subtracts by adding, and it multiplies by adding, and it divides by subtracting. So when someone tells you that the Curta does square roots, what they really mean is that somebody figured out how to do square roots just by adding and multiplying. And that's true. There are actually several procedures for doing square roots just by adding and multiplying, and it's pretty easy if you know what you're doing. There was an official pamphlet with tables made up for this purpose, the Curta Square Root Tables. I got this scanned from curtamania.com. I'll put a link down there. This may look complicated, but it's pretty easy. You start with a number and you want the square root. That means your number you start with is the square of some other number, like n squared, and you need to find n. You look in the square root tables to find the closest value you can to what you started with. This is called r squared. And then the table also tells you the value of 1 over 2r. And how about some algebraic nonsense? The approximation at the end is because you choose n and r to be very close together. But you don't need to follow all that. Just trust me that n is approximately equal to n squared plus r squared times 1 over 2r. And all of these things are easy to do with the Curta. N squared is what we started with. R squared is the value on the table. And 1 over 2r is the other value on the table. Let's just try the square root of 2. So 2 is my n squared. I look in the table for a value as close to 2 as possible, and I see 1.99496. That's my r squared. So I do the n squared plus the r squared. That's 2 plus 1.99496, and I do that on the Curta. Now I multiply this number by 1 over 2r, which is also on the table. It's 354. Now because I need to multiply, I have to manually transfer the current answer, 3.99496, into the input. This step is sometimes a pain, although it's easy in this example. Multiply by 354. Oh boy, look at that. 6 digits of accuracy. Here I'm going to try the square root of 747. I have to think of this as 7.47 and then place the decimals around as needed. I add 7.47, which is the n squared. Look in the table, I see r squared is 7.54740, so I add that. Transfer that back to the input. Now multiply by 1 over r squared, which is 182. Right on. Really, it's just one addition and one multiplication, no problem. The worst part is that step where you have to copy the number on top back into the input. And this is the second time where I see a design deficiency in the Curta. Some desktop machines included a back transfer mechanism. This would automatically transfer the value on the answers back into the input. Watch how the numbers at the bottom there are going to get transferred back onto the sliders at the top. This involves using the answer gears to drive the main input gears into a new position, but the Curta can't do that. A back transfer would somehow require the answer wheels to move the input sliders into specific positions. That's just not going to work on the Curta. There's a huge amount of friction in the sliders, and the answer wheels are nowhere near strong enough to push them up and down. So you just got to do it yourself. It's tedious, but not so bad. There were actually some simple tricks to get around the back transfer, but I don't really want to get into that. Would you believe me that there's a very similar trick for cube roots? Turns out you can do the same kinds of algebraic nonsense to show this. And this table for cube roots appears in a book called Curta Calculating Techniques, which I also got from curtamania.com. Again, the table tells you what you need to know. You just have to add r cubed twice, then multiply by 1 over 3r squared. Let's just try the cube root of 451. I add 451. I look up my r cubed is 450.758, so I add that twice. Then the back transfer. And then I multiply by 567. Still got it. Square and cube roots. That's pretty impressive if you got those tables. But really, this is not special to the Curta. These were standard techniques at the time, and anybody with a desktop machine could do these in exactly the same way. Even better if they had a back transfer. But wait, your mansplaining friend says, haven't you heard that the Curta can also calculate any standard mathematical function like sines and cosines, exponentials and logs? The proper response to this gentleman is to politely turn before rolling your eyes. Yes, my friend, the Curta can calculate sines, cosines, logarithms, more or less any function you've ever heard of, as long as you know the Taylor series. Just to placate the mansplainers, let's just try to evaluate the exponential function at x equals 0.75. I'm going to use a 4th degree Taylor polynomial, which any sensible person would write like this. But it's actually more convenient for us to write the coefficients as decimals like this. And here's a cute trick. That thing is the same as this, and I'm going to write that the other way around, and what you see here can just be evaluated left to right by doing additions and multiplications. That means you can do it with the Curta. So I'm going to try to evaluate this at x equals 0.75. This involves 4 steps of multiplying, adding, and then back transferring each time. It's a bit much for my tastes, and I'm not very confident that I did it right. It's kind of close. The accuracy is limited by the Taylor approximation and also by the number of digits I'm maintaining in each step on the Curta. So anyway, the Curta really just does addition and multiplication. Those are the fundamental operations emanating from the soul of the machine itself. Everything else, roots, logs, whatever, these are inventions of men thrust onto the machine with our clumsy fingers. All this business here, I wouldn't call that a Curta technique. It is really a mathematical technique. And there is some real beauty there. It's a bit of a deep realization that these other complex operations can be approximated simply by adding and multiplying. And as someone who appreciates this kind of beauty, do I want to try another example? I do not. There were 2 different models of the Curta calculator, the Type I and the Type II. Mine is the Type I, which has 8 input digits, 6 counter digits, and 11 answer digits. The Type II is bigger. It has 11 input digits, 8 counter digits, and 15 answer digits. Because of this, the Type II is a little bit bigger in diameter, but pretty much the same height. The Type II came out 6 years after the Type I, and it costs a little bit more, but from 1953 onwards, they were making both types. Curt had always intended to make the two different types. He had drawn up plans for both types, even in Buchenwald. And the early Type I machines still say Type I, even before the Type II existed. But the size is really the only difference. There aren't any new features on the Type II. Although eventually the Type II did have color variants. There was a plain black one that looks just like the Type I, and then there was also a gray one. They made about 80,000 Type Is and 60,000 Type IIs. Apart from the two types, the Curta did go through a few very slight variations. The very early Type Is had a few different versions of the logo text on them, and the sliders were round pegs instead of rectangular tabs. Eventually they settled on the design that mine has. My serial number is in the 12,000s, which puts it towards the beginning of the Type I lifespan, but not so early that the design is weird. After they settled on the standard design, the most visible variation was in the crank. Mine represents the original design. The rounded top fits perfectly into the rubber thing in the top of the case. But sometime in the early 60s, after Curt had left the company, they started making the crank out of plastic, and they added this arrow on it. It's a small change, but it's pretty obvious once you see it. The crank doesn't have a rounded top anymore. Curt himself hated this change. The rounded top was there to make a perfect contact with the rubber in the case, so that the machine wouldn't move around at all when it's in the case. Once they flattened the top, the fit in the case wasn't as good. Around the same time, they started making the clearing ring out of plastic. Curt didn't like that either. One little variation that I actually do like was the red ring indicating subtraction mode when you pop the doink. Simple visual feedback. I like it. The colored tabs are nice too, although the red ones kind of ruin the design. Changing the top of the machine meant that the case had to change a bit, and actually the metal case changed design several times, and in later years it was made entirely in plastic. And there were some variations that never came to pass. Curt himself, even after he left the Cantina company, got a couple of patents for Curta-like machines. Apparently Curt was still interested in pushing the technology forward for parallel computations with the Curta. Like I said before, you can enter several numbers next to each other, but with only 8 digits of input, it's hard to do this seriously. Of course, the Type II has 11 digits, which is better, but still kind of limited. And I guess you could redesign it to be even bigger if you want, but Curt had grander ideas. What if you could just have 2 Curtas, like use both input registers, and somehow link the cranks together so that they worked in parallel? Curt got this patent in 1954. It's 2 Curtas stacked on top of each other. They share the same crank, which means you can enter as many numbers as you can fit onto both Curtas, and then crank it to multiply everything by the same amount. Now I could do my entire yogurt flatbreads recipe. The idea in the patent is that these are fully functional Curtas all on their own, but you could somehow pop the top off one and attach it to another one to chain them up. It's like my old TI-83 link cable. 2 Curtas stuck together. What will they think of next? But don't even bother. Curt already thought of it. He also drew up an idea for putting the Curtas next to each other, driven by a big crank in the middle. Once you do that, you might as well do as many as you want. Yeah, 5 of them. It's a little silly, but the idea of the Curta as some kind of modular thing which can be used by itself, but also networked as part of a cluster. You might be onto something, Curt. A few people even wrote in to tell me about some Curta hot rodders who built these things themselves back in the day. James Robb at the University of Birmingham made this crazy machine in 1953. This is 12 off-the-shelf Curtas with their cranks cut off. Then they put this big spinning drum in the middle, which can turn the individual Curta cranks and also turn the digit shifters. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that Curt ever knew about this thing, but I imagine that he would have been pleased. Or maybe he would have been annoyed that they ripped off his idea. Curt got his patents for the modular parallel Curta, but he never actually produced one. Every Curta came with its own case, but did you know that there was an official leather case with shoulder strap? I've wanted to get one of these for a while, but they don't come up on eBay very often, and I've never seen one for sale all by itself. They're always being sold along with a Curta. But I already got one. Some ultimate Curta collectors have theirs in the original cardboard box. I hate to say it, but I dislike the box. I like the Helvetica, but this has got nothing to do with the timeless design of the Curta itself. They could have done better. The marketing for the Curta was pretty typical for the time period, though the time period was pretty extensive. They were selling the same machine from 1947 to 1971. The world changed a lot during that time, and so did the Curta marketing. I think they're pretty interesting, so let's just look at a few. I found most of these in the excellent gallery at curta.li. LI is for Liechtenstein. I'll put a link down there. Hey, just for fun, let's do it like a YouTuber. What is Curta? Most of the early Curta ads have the Curta in somebody's hand. They were really trying to make it clear this was a small handheld device. Here's another one with that hand. It's fast, silent, 4 operations. Square roots, n squared, n cubed. And that. Huh? Here's another one trying to show you the size of it. Right next to your smokes. Look at that text. Reminds me of one of those TikToks I made. Curta. 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 This is an American one which shows the price. $125 for the Type I and $165 for the Type II. That's a steal today. This crazy multiplication, do it in 6 seconds on your handheld Curta calculator. I don't think I could do that in 6 seconds on the Curta. Here's another one a little bit later. It's the Curta next to a hand, not a real hand though. And here you can see the beginnings of a slightly more feminine touch in the Curta advertising. These look like some real nice lady hands. I really like this design here. Look at those arrows. I don't know what they mean. They got arrows. Meet Curta. I'm interested. Here's those same hands. 11 plus. This one has a little brain teaser on it. Curta saves hours. If S equals 3, what do the hours total? I actually thought about this one for a while. I don't know what they're getting at here. It's some kind of puzzle, I guess. You can send in your answers to London office machines. I don't know. Leave a comment. I like this one here. You got this guy, the old guy with the old heavy machine, and then this other guy with the 12 Curtas in the briefcase. This guy's packing some serious heat. 1 calculator or 12. Here's a classroom full of Curtas. Look at all these. I can't tell if they're kids or grown women, but they're all learning something about the Curta. Look at that, huh? This one looks like she's chewing on it. Here's what I like to see. A totally abstract picture of the Curta on a chessboard. I like it. Oh, I really like this one. That's a face, I guess. And some stuff, some words. All right, this is my favorite one. This is a series of 5 little guys on the same theme, of all about different ways you can use your Curta. Here's one. You can do the Curta for like bookkeeping or something. I don't know. Aerospace, making rockets. Curta's got you. You got aviation. This guy looks like he's going to crash, but Curta. Mountaineering, I suppose. They use the Curta for mountaineering. We got one more. Check it out. What else can you use the Curta for? Penguins. This goofy looking, this guy. Googly-eyed penguin. You know how he got that way? The Curta. Can you make a fake number file video? Every video I make is a fake number file video. But seriously, I would love to be on number file. Anybody know a guy? I got material. Are we going to get a video about how the mechanism does carries? I went into a lot of detail about how the stepped drum works, but I didn't mention how it handles carries from one digit to the next. It's actually a bit complicated because the addition and the subtraction modes need to handle carries differently. And I talked about how when you pop the doink, it shifts to the drum to subtract instead of adding. But it also has to switch the entire carrying system to behave appropriately for subtraction rather than addition. This How the Curta Works video describes it in detail using models of the original parts. I decided it was a bit more complicated than I wanted to get into. Of all the devices on this channel, which do you use the most often? I don't really use any of them very often. I have used the denominator counters a few times, like playing board games with my kids and stuff, but other than that, I don't think I use them. I think probably the Gerber variable scale is maybe one of the most useful because what it does is hard to do using electronics, but I don't actually do it. As a professional academic, do you have thoughts of starting some museum-esque collection with all of them? I have thought about this, but I don't really consider myself much of a true collector. I like having these things, but I like having them so that I can kind of play around with them and get to know how they work and even, show them off to other people. But I don't really get a lot out of sort of stockpiling them in my house. I'm content to love them for a while and then pass them along. I also hate administrative nonsense, so starting and running my own museum sounds kind of like a nightmare to me. I love all the math gizmos. My TI-36X Pro has been my go-to since college. I carry it with me in my briefcase always. Do you carry the Curta with you or something else? I don't carry the Curta with me. I actually don't carry any kind of little calculator with me. I don't even own a fancy graphing calculator. To me, the handheld calculator is a bit of a legacy technology. Like in my real ordinary life, my smartphone built-in calculator app gets me by. If I want to do something a little bit fancier, I often use the free Desmos graphing calculator app, which is pretty good. If I want to do something really serious for serious mathematics, I use a serious computer. If I am struck with an adding machine, is that battery or assault? I would never use an adding machine to attack someone, but if you come at me, I got a good counter. Heyo! I'm probably the Curta hater in the sense that I don't see the point of it in a world where slide rules exist. Cool in a fancy watch with way too many complications way, though. I appreciate the hot take. I do see how it's kind of like a fancy watch, very mechanically beautiful, but is it actually useful for anything? Well, back in the day, I think it was pretty useful. Slide rules can only get you approximations, so there really was a place for a thing like the Curta. Anonymous Hyena says, making Curta-themed furry art. Is that all right? That's amazing. Since I was young, I've always been fascinated by the computations some people were able to do from the top of their heads. I wanted to know what an actual mathematician had to say about mental calculations and how to improve them. Hugs from Brazil and happy Kurtzmas, dala dala dala. Oh, those are Brazil flags. Actually, I'm pretty bad at mental calculations. This is why nobody ever thought I was good at math when I was a kid, and I think this is actually fairly common among career mathematicians. For accountants and engineers, that kind of thing might be helpful, but for mathematicians in general, it's not so much. I always thought that I was kind of bad at math, but once I got to college, I realized that math wasn't exactly what I thought it was, and what it is, I actually am kind of good at. I've always been fascinated at how most mechanical calculating devices have at most one spark of an idea and then years of refinement, where the Curta is just an entirely different thing that didn't evolve from other devices, nor did anything really evolve from it. This is interesting to consider, like the long arc of the history of computing technology is full of maverick devices. First there was the abacus, now we have the smartphone, but the smartphone did not arise by incremental improvements on the abacus. The abacus, the slide rule, the tranche, the pinwheel calculator, the dial adders, the binary digital computer, these things were not variations on earlier designs, but they were individually totally new inventions. And it's tempting to put the Curta in the same category. It looks nothing like what came before, and it didn't evolve into anything that came after. This view would paint Curt as a wild, eccentric genius who came out of nowhere, created something brilliant, and then quickly vanished. But Curt wasn't really an eccentric outsider at all. He grew up in the industry. And he doesn't talk about it in his interviews, but there were other Curta-like designs in the air at the time. This is the Petersson calculator from the 1870s, which is basically the same idea as a Curta, a single-step drum with digits arranged cylindrically around it. My buddy Stephen Freeborn sent me this patent in 1900 for another cylindrical stepped drum machine by Christian Hamann. And here's another one called the Gauss calculator. So rather than some kind of alien artifact that descended from a mountaintop, I would say that Curt's design really is an evolution on the arithmometer type machines that his dad was building. Not to take anything away from Curt's achievement, even if other people had similar ideas, Curt actually got the thing made in significant numbers, which is more than you can say for anybody else. I don't know what that thing is, but it looks stupid. You're on the wrong side of the internet, buddy. Jake says, Curta. Actually, he says this on every video. This guy gets it. Are there other, perhaps non-mathematical adjacent machines or instruments which you haven't had the chance to talk about in a video? They're all kind of mathy, but I have some other doodads which I think are cool, but I don't know if they really fit my format. Check this out. This is a little guy, huh? Can you see that? It's a little guy. I got this thing too. This is a baseball balls and strikes counter. Each thing has a little clicker. The ball clicker counts up to 4 and then goes back to 0. The strikes and the outs go up to 3, and there's an innings one which goes up to 9. I kind of like that. I have a small collection of old staplers. Is that something? Why do you think the Curt is so much more popular among collectors now than other portable mechanical calculators? Now this is a question worthy of discussion. This is a Comptometer Model F. It's really a beautiful machine in perfect working order. I bought it for $40. This Comptometer is over 100 years old, and they made about 40,000 of this model. My Curta calculator is about 70 years old, and they made 140,000 of them. But $40 will not buy you a Curta. Somehow the Curta has achieved a status that isn't really matched by any other computing machine. It's obvious that the Curta is an amazing instrument, but that's not really enough by itself. There's got to be some reasons that the Curta seems to have risen to the top in everybody's mind. As far as collectibles go, it's not really all that rare. Certainly Curtas today are pretty abundant on eBay, and it's easy to get one if you're willing to pay. I think its abundance and availability actually helps to keep it in the public eye among potential collectors. You want to see something actually rare? I have a Gerber graph analog that took me years to find. Far more rare than the Curta, and a remarkable device. And when I finally found one, I paid $50 for it, because nobody cares. So why do they care about the Curta? One reason, surely, is that the Curta just looks so different from other classic adding machines. Big metal machines like this or this. Most people these days have probably never used one, but they know what they are. They say, okay, yeah, that's an old adding machine. But the Curta doesn't get the same reaction. And part of why I love it is because the design is so distinctive. It's an old adding machine that doesn't look like an old adding machine. And it doesn't really look that old either. It certainly doesn't look like it's from the 1940s. I can tell that it must be old because nobody would ever make a mechanical calculator today, but the unique design of it makes it hard to place historically. And I'm sure the size of it is part of the appeal. The miniaturization is really the Curta's killer feature, but even today, on a practical level, this smallness helps to make it into a perfect collectible. A little guy like this is far more attractive to buy and sell online and store and display in a collection. Most people, even if they were interested, are not going to dedicate the shelf space to keeping a collection of comptometers. But a Curta can easily slip into your china cabinet for weeks before your wife even notices. Anyone even notices. Lots of people say the Curta is the smallest mechanical calculating machine ever constructed. But what if I told you there was another? In 1961, there actually was a somewhat similar device, specifically positioned as a competitor to the Curta. This is the Alpina Universal Calculator, and it actually is rare. They only made about 5,000 of these, far less than the Curta. I don't have one because, But even if you wanted to pay the big bucks, there usually aren't any available. So why isn't this thing every collector's dream? I don't think this guy even has one. It functions very similarly to the Curta. It has 8 input digits that you do directly with these turny gears at the top, a 6-digit counter down here, and 13 answer digits. That's 2 more than the Curta. Stephen Freeborn has one. Here's what it looks like in action. You shift the digits by, shifting the digits. It's comparable in size to the Curta, but it's flatter, so you really could put it in your pocket. Internally, it's a pretty standard pinwheel mechanism, which was probably easier to make and maintain than Curt's stepped drum. Unfortunately for modern collectors, the case is all plastic, which can break pretty easily if you drop it. Stephen Freeborn actually has another one with a broken case. He even broke a piece off of it during his video. I've never held one in my hand, but at a glance, it's impressive. Certainly it seems like the Alpina could be as good as the Curta, but it has nowhere near the clout. I think really what the Alpina lacks is a compelling story. Clout is built when people talk about it, when people tell stories about it. And storytelling has always been a part of the Curta's popularity. Really, this is how I try to present all of my old machines. When they were new, their value was in their function, in using them. But today their usefulness has evaporated entirely. These things are not tools anymore, but cultural artifacts. Their value is determined by how they make us feel, by the stories that they tell and the stories that we tell about them. For most of these things, I value them because of what they represent in the big story, the story of human technology throughout the centuries. Little steps one by one, some giant leaps, and forgotten today, but not by everyone. And the Curta occupies a place of honor in that story, the last and the greatest of the mechanical calculators, the culmination of the 300-year history of the stepped drum. But the story of the Curta is even bigger than just the technology. Gibson describes this in his book, talking about why Hobbes, the collector, is obsessed with the Curta so much. It is about the ultimate provenance, the camps, Herzstark and Buchenwald, surrounded by death, by methodical erasure, by an almost certain fate. He continued to work. In the end, the camp was liberated. He walked free, never having abandoned his vision of the calculator. Hobbes honors that triumph, that escape. He has something he needs to escape himself. Curt's story really is a huge factor in the continued popularity of the Curta. It's why any article, any book, any video about the Curta, they all mention Buchenwald. It positions the Curta not only as a milestone computing device, but an artifact of a particular striking moment of human history, a product of World War II, the camps, the Holocaust, the depths of human evil, and the desperate need to survive. If you watch my videos, you know that I see depth and meaning in these old things. Not just mathematical or mechanical beauty, but human beauty. Emotional value that's enduring and universal. Sometimes that beauty is below the surface and I try to bring it out a little, but the Curta makes it easy. It's beautiful as an object, obviously mechanically brilliant, and it's steeped in the grand story of humanity of the 20th century. To me, it's emotionally evocative in a way that these other things just can't compare. The Curta calculator is the greatest mechanical calculator ever created. That's what they say, at least. What do I say? Well, yeah.